Come join us as we explore what it means to be the church and study God's purpose and intention for us as the body of Christ in this place.
And speaking of Christmas, I learned a new definition for frustration this year: fixing Christmas lights. So I think I told you guys last year was the first year I ever put up Christmas lights. I've always had an apartment or a situation like that. Never really had a place in order to put them. So last year I had a lot of fun and put up some lights around the parsonage. That means this year is the first year I get to experience trying to get them to work. And I pulled out all the strands of lights and turned them on, and not a single one of them worked right. And I spent hours popping lights out, checking them, trying to figure out what was wrong. And always it was the same problem. You know, there was a light missing I didn't know, a piece that wasn't there. Till finally, you might notice we have different lights up this year. I did give up finally. Well, it was in that frustration that I was thinking, you know, I get the feeling as I come to this section of Scripture that Dan just read for us, I'm getting the sense that's sort of how Paul is feeling at this point. He's been correcting problems, one at a time. This isn't his first letter to this church. He lived in this place in Corinth, and there has been this consistent problem. It comes back to one question: is the church working as it should? Is the church functioning as it's supposed to? Or, like in Corinth, were they breaking down and constantly focusing on themselves? So, for them, it's a question: are they choosing to be active for things of God or just for things of self? And we can ask ourselves that same question. We might not be Corinth, but we can still struggle with that. Are we making choices, making decisions to be active, to build ourselves up, to puff ourselves up, or are we willing to be out there to build up the church and build out the church? I think this time of year it can be sort of easy to lose track of that. We get very busy in the Christmas season, and it's amazing that this tends to be a year where there's a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety. The reason why is because people feel like they need to do enough, to give enough, and sometimes there's a lack of community, or especially this time of year, a lack of family that they can reach out to. And it can just seem broken because they're not getting what they need. Well, sometimes we can just focus ourselves in the church a little bit too much about what we need, rather than how we can help and reach out others. When we need to be active in building up the church and building out the church, focusing on what the church needs to love one another and to love our neighbors. So that's what we find Paul pushing towards here. How do we love one another? How do we love our neighbors? With our gifts. So if you're not there yet, please turn there with me. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, what Dan has read for us. A long passage that we're looking at today, 1 Corinthians 14, 1 through 25, as Paul is just stepping into the issues again. He's stepping on some toes here, and he's talking about something that keeps coming up, and that's the topic of tongues. What they are and the problem with them in the church. Because in Corinth, that church was active, but they were active for all the wrong reason. And so we're looking at that today. What it means to puff up or to build up. You know, which choice is the church going to make? What it looks like to actually direct yourself inside, how we can build up the church, and how we can direct ourselves outside, building out the church. So that's what we're looking at today, to puff up or build up, to build up the church, and then to build out the church. And it begins with puffing up, or building up. As we get to this section, these mini verses, we see that it's all about tongues and prophecy. So we can sort of get that out of the way real quick. Here it goes. Stop speaking in unknown languages. In the middle of service, stop getting up, talking in unknown languages if there's no interpretation. I don't care if it's French, Chinese, Spanish. If there's not an interpreter for it, you got to keep quiet about that. That's what Paul's teaching here. So as I was thinking of that, I mean, that's about it. We're done. We can pray and we can go home. So Brandon, I guess you win. I heard an amen. So sorry, Dave, you know that's not the case. Because if it were just tongues and prophecy, that'd be easy enough. We could just say, stop doing it. All right, not in church without interpretation. But that's not Paul's point here. Because the controversy that's going on isn't just about tongues. It's about using gifts. It's about how we are active and how we live as the church. Now, I will say it seems to revolve around this for the Corinthians, this problem of tongues. And I'm sure at this point, Paul's probably just saying, why is it always a controversy about this? It's either factions or it's about tongues and getting attention. Why can't I ever receive a letter from them about all their struggles with everybody who just wants to work in nursery? We only have 8 spots and there's 15 people who are bursting down the doors to do it. It's just so hard. Now, that would be a controversy to have, but that's not what he's dealing with. His controversy here is about speaking in tongues. All right, so we're not going to focus too much on tongues themselves, because we're going to be looking at the point Paul's making, but just to cover that real quick, a lot of people go to this section to learn about what tongues are. Now, Paul, he's not explaining it here. He's not explaining tongues. In fact, he doesn't really explain them anywhere very well, but we can see the language that he's using. So when we see this weird word, tongues, what is he talking about? Well, tongues means language. I mean, we still use that sometimes, mean language. In fact, it'd probably do a good job if they stopped translating it tongues, because we don't use that word so often for language, but it does mean language. He's using the Greek word here, glossa. You might hear that word and think of glossary, a collection of words. Well, a glossa is a language, a collection of words. He also uses the word phoneia and dialecta. Again, words that you might recognize a little bit. Phonetics, phoneia, phonetics, dialect. Dialect, we just use that word. We just use the Greek word dialect to speak of a type of language. But here he is using that word glossa. And that means a language. It just means a language, either known or unknown. So what type of language is he talking about here? There's a lot of debate about that. You probably heard some of that debate. Now, if I'm just going to be honest with the text, look at it, not taking my own presuppositions, but see what he's talking about. It seems like he's talking about some sort of unknown spiritual language that was being used that only God could understand. The problem with that is that since God could only understand that, and they're using it in church, no one is benefiting from it. So what Paul is trying to say, the point that he's making in here, is that you need to use what gift is best for the church. Not just for building yourself up, as people were doing in Corinth, where they would stand up and speak in what probably sounded like gibberish in order to get attention to themselves and build up a circle around themselves because, well, it got them attention. It showed power for them. Now, if you want more about understanding what tongues are, the history of it, the background, the heresies that have popped up over the centuries, I'm more than happy to go through that with you. We can do a little class and all of that. If you're interested, let me know. You should know by now. I'd love to talk about that. We're not going to focus there today. We're going to look at what his point is. Because the truth is, we're not struggling with the problem of tongues here in this church right now. And yet, these verses are every bit as relevant for us and how we act as the church. So we're not looking at the particulars, but we are looking at the point. And Paul's point is, like we've said, are you going to keep puffing yourself up, or are you going to get to work building up the church? So what do we need to do? Look at this first verse, and he gives us 2 things right off the bat here. He says this in verse 1 of chapter 14. Pursue love and earnestly desire the spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy. 2 things that we need to listen to. 2 things we need to hear well. And then he adds that idea about prophecy because he's trying to direct them from gifts that aren't useful to a gift that is useful for the church. So first, pursue love. This is the first thing we need to do as a church. This is the primary thing. Before anything else, we need to be looking at pursuing love. And when it says pursue love, it's not like pursuing your love, like chasing after a person. Pursue love means, is love what you do in your life? Is it central to what you do? Are you running after that for other people? Do you love well? See, this is an action for Paul, like we talked about last week, going over the love passage. Love is an action here, finding ways to love people. That should come first for the church. So that's a good check for us. Is that first for us? But second, it's not just pursue love, it's also pursuing that spiritual growth. Seek after those things. Now he adds in here the idea of prophecy, and I think he's doing that because this is where they're doing it wrong. They were focusing on speech gifts. They were focusing on gifts of speech because that was what was important in their society. So instead of focusing on tongues, he wants them to focus on prophecy, something that will be helpful, that he'll go ahead and explain to us. Because he shows us here that, well, where does it go wrong? It can go wrong when we use our gifts in the wrong way. And he sets these gifts against each other here as we look at verse 2. He says this, "For one who speaks in a tongue speaks not to men, but to God. For no one understands him, but he utters mysteries in the Spirit. On the other hand, the one who prophesies speaks to people for their upbuilding and encouragement and consolation. The one who speaks in a tongue builds up himself, but the one who prophesies builds up the church." He's setting two gifts against each other here. One that focuses on building up the self, the other that focuses on building up the church. This is what was happening there in Corinth. They were using their gifts, their God-given spiritual gifts, in order to puff up themselves instead of the church. Tongues on one side, prophecy on the other. And this is how he says that the prophecy would build up the church. Gives us an idea of what he's talking about here. He says that it is for upbuilding, it is for encouragement, and it's consolation. Upbuilding, that goes back to the idea oikodomio that we've talked about, that Greek word oikodomio, building up a house. All right, this is why it's helpful. When he's talking about prophecy, he's talking about speaking the heart of God to somebody. It's useful for building up. This is teaching, building up the inside, giving it structure. But not just that, encouragement. Speaking the heart of God to somebody is encouragement. Now, this isn't encouraging somebody when they're down. This is encouraging somebody to get out there and do the work that's been given to them. This is building up belief in them and encouraging them and preparing them for action. And it's also for consolation. Hearing the heart of God can console us when we're grieving, comforting us with the word. So for us, are we puffing up? Might not be using tongues, but there's other ways to do that. Are we using our gifts or even not using our gifts in a way to puff ourselves up? It's not about doing stuff or keeping busy. I think the question is, what are you doing in your spiritual life? Is it to just puff yourself up, or is it to reach out to others who are in need? Is it pursuing love? And what do we do at church? Not just ourselves, but what do we do at church? Is it what we do at church just for us? To build ourselves up individually, to puff ourselves up? Or do we do it with a mind of how we can build up this church? Now, Paul's careful here. He doesn't want to make him feel too bad. Tongues, as he says, isn't a bad gift. He says here in verse 5, he says, "Now I want you all to speak in tongues, but even more to prophesy. The one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless someone interprets, so that the church may be built up." You see, he's not forbidding them from using this gift, but he wants them to use it in the right way. See, and that's, any gift can be like that if it's used in the wrong way, because some gifts out of their context are not going to build up. Now, so what happens then? What does he show us? Well, he turns the focus. He wants us to shift our focus of where those gifts go, and he uses that image of instruments again. So here in verse 6, as we pick it up and see, he says, "Now, brothers, if I come to you speaking in tongues, how will I benefit you unless I bring you some revelation or knowledge or prophecy or teaching? If even lifeless instruments such as the flute or the harp do not give distinct notes, how will anyone know what is played? And if the bugle gives an indistinct sound, who will get ready for battle? So with yourselves, if with your tongue you utter speech that is not intelligible, how will anyone know what is said? For you will be speaking into the air. There are doubtless many different languages in the world, and none is without meaning. But if I do not know what the meaning of the language, I will be a foreigner to the speaker, and the speaker a foreigner to me." Well, here, Paul's showing us the reason that tongues puff up. Really, the reason any gift can puff up, it's about the focus. It's shifting it from others to the self. Now, he's talking about using this gift here in the context of a battle, giving direction in a battle. You know, a bugle is blown in a battle to do what? To give direction, to tell when to charge, to tell when to retreat, when to go to the right or when to go to the left. And that's a proper use of it. But if it's not being used right, if the sound is indistinct, it's just noise. It's just noise seeking to get attention. Now, we're the church. That means we are at war as well. We are at war with the forces of the enemy, and we don't need confusion. I was thinking one way that we can think about it when it comes to the church and when it comes to our words is we don't all have language gifts. That's true. Not all of us are gifted in different gifts of speech, but we do all have words that we can use. And how do we use those words? You know, when we're in the church, when we're in our families, when we're dealing with friends, do we use our words to direct? You know, do we use our words to build up, to encourage, or to console people? Or do we use our words to sort of get attention, or even get back at people, to hurt people? Because that's when it puffs up. It's easy to catch ourselves in that. I have a good friend who likes to say that he has the gift of sarcasm, the spiritual gift of sarcasm. And to be fair, he uses it mostly to good purpose. But still, we might say that, and that's unveiling a little truth for us. One thing that I used to say about myself is that I had the wonderful spiritual gift of discouragement. I was really good at that. I could really, discourage you well. Well, that's not good. That does unveil a little bit of my heart that needed quite a bit of work on, and probably still does. Even when we just use our words wrong, it's like that image of the balloon that we've talked about before. It puffs up. It doesn't build up. There's no structure in it. It looks like something's going on, but nothing's really going on, and it helps no one, especially when it comes to words. It can simply be filled with hot air, and that's it. Our gifts that we are given, the way we act in church, we can do that sometimes when the focus is wrong and it's on ourselves. All right, so what pops up here? Whatever we do, focusing on ourselves, even gifts, and it's not just tongues. Anything that we do solely to bring benefit to ourselves. So what do we do then, if that's a problem? And I would assume that most of us, if we examined our hearts, might find some areas, at least some areas where that might be the case. So what are we to do about that then? Well, Paul's instruction is to build up and build out the church. He starts with building up the church here. To build up the church, he starts here with this verse 12, which really seems like a key statement, a key verse that he's given. And these words here in verse 12 should be words that excite us, should be words that give us a vision of what life could be like if we're chasing after God. He says here this, verse 12, "So with yourselves, since you are eager for manifestations of the Spirit, strive to excel in building up the church." I think that's another good one to memorize there. Are you eager for manifestations of the Spirit? Well, what's a manifestation of the Spirit? It means God at work. Are you eager to see God at work in your life? Because if that's the case, if you can say, I want to see God at work, I want to know that God is active, He gives us something to do. He tells us what to do to see that. He says to strive to excel in building up the church. Striving here, that's not just gritting your teeth. That means to chase after it. Chase after what? This richness of building up the church. It's that word oikodomio again, like building up the house. If you want to see God at work, that's what we need to do. Make a choice and do it well. So if you want to see God at work, an easy way to do that is get involved with the church. When it comes to the church, we're not just, a group of people who like getting together because we like one another. Hopefully we do. But we don't just get together and, enjoy wearing wonderful matching sweaters. I do, but that's not the point. Now, we as the church, we are God's chosen way to interact with the world. The church is God's chosen way to interact with the world. So if you want to see God at work, the way to do it is to get involved. And how do you do that? Well, there are plenty of things you can do to build up. I can think of things around the church here to get involved with, things like, we have lots of people who teach classes. That's something you can always do. You can get people together, lead groups, small groups, things that you can do, and you can do it. Now, maybe you feel you don't have time, but there are ways that you can connect. There are ways you can connect and encourage people, going back to what he said about prophecy, in order to build up, encourage, and to console. I'll tell you one way, like mentioned a little jokingly earlier, you can help out with the nursery. We always need help with that. Children's church or the youth, things that you can get involved with. I know it's easy to just hear some of those and let them pass you by, sort of not think about it, but if you want to see God at work, you got to get involved. If you want to see God active in your life, get involved with the church. I'll be honest, I've never seen God all that active in my life when I was just sitting there not doing anything. Never seen God active in my life when I was just sitting on the couch whiling away the hours. Might be enjoyable, might be fun, but God's not too, I don't see much of that manifestation of the Spirit there. But when we get to work, when we step out, God is there with us. So if you don't want to see Him at work, that's really easy. Just don't be involved. You know, if that's your desire, if you don't want to see Him, that's fine. Just don't be involved. But Paul, he goes on here. He goes on here and he starts talking about this difference between the spirit and the mind. Now, in his context, what he's showing here is that if we're going to build up the church, we need to include others. We're not doing this alone. Those people who were using tongues for attention, they were actually excluding people who didn't speak in tongues like them. So Paul says it like this in verse 13, "Therefore, one who speaks in a tongue should pray that he may interpret. For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. What am I to do? I will pray with my spirit, but I will also pray with my mind. I will sing praise with my spirit, but I will sing with my mind also. Otherwise, if you give thanks with your spirit, how can anyone in the position of an outsider say amen to your thanksgiving when he does not know what you are saying? For you may be giving thanks well enough, but the other person is not being built up." Now, he's still talking about in the church. The outsider isn't an actual outsider, someone outside the church. That's someone who's being put in the place of an outsider. That means they're being made an outsider because they're not sharing in this gift, and there's this circle of people who could, and so somebody is set outside. Instead of getting involved, what they were doing in Corinth was they were doing things for themselves and in a way that others couldn't join in. Now, that's a persistent danger. They were building a little club of people, of special people. You know, we would call that a clique. And they were excluding other people. And if we're going to be the church, we can't do that. That is the surest way to bring damage into the church, is to do things like that. And the problem with tongues for them was that it was alienating people. So if no one understood, then no one was being blessed. No one could join in. No one could be built up. Now, if we want to build the church, then, another thing Paul's pointing out here is we need to be able to invite others into what we are doing. Now, that can be a challenge at times, but that's what we're called to do things with involvement, to intentionally involve other people in our lives and in what we are doing, to strive to build up the church, yes, and then get others involved. That's what we need to do. And then lastly, this, as he talks about building up the church, he says to be mature. So he goes back to talking about these Corinthians as children again, something that he's done a few times. But he says this here, "I thank God that I speak in tongues more than all of you. Nevertheless, in church, I would rather speak 5 words with my mind in order to instruct others than 10,000 words in a tongue. Brothers, do not be children in your thinking. Be infants in evil, but in your thinking be mature." All right, he's accusing them of being childish again. This has come up before. They're acting like children. And here, in acting like children, what they're doing is they're choosing this myriad, that's the word there for 10,000, myriad, a myriad of these unknown words because it looks good, rather than 5 words that would actually help somebody. They were making that choice. Paul's instructing them to make the other choice. You probably see why that's childish. You could imagine, for those of us with small children right now, very often they would very happily choose the myriad of, let's say, candy that's out there, even though we know all that will do to them, rather than 5 healthy things that maybe they could share with someone else. Now, I know my kids, for all their training, probably would still take the myriad of candy because that's childish thinking. Now, the truth is, maybe some of us adults would do the same thing. I don't know if I want to put myself to that test, but that's the question for these Corinthians. Are they willing to go after what is better, or are they going to stick going after what just feels good in the moment? They were making a poor choice, and they were using childish thinking. So mature thinking is this: what can I do for other people? Childish thinking is, what can I do for me? Those are two ways of thinking that he's putting forth here. And what he's telling these Corinthians is this: be mature in your thinking. And we got to do that as well, to be mature. We could probably think of plenty of examples, but we can sure look busy, look like we're doing a lot when there's not much that's really going on. So easy to get busy and add many things. And at times it might even look like holiness because you're running yourself so ragged, but it's not. The question needs to be asked, what is all that business for? Is it for yourself or for others? Is it 10,000 things for yourself, or is it 5 things that you were doing for somebody else? So, striving to build up the church, inviting others to come into that work with us, and thinking of others with mature thinking. Those are ways to build up the church. 3 things that he's giving there. And that's the first direction. And that falls in lines with Jesus' commandment to love one another, because he's talking about things within the church. And we are called to love one another as he has loved us. But that's not all, because we're also called to love our neighbors. So Paul turns his mind to that as well. And he shows them that they not only need to build up the church, that's build up people in the church itself, but also to build out the church, to be a place where outreach can happen. So when it comes to dealing with those outside the church, the heart here is, what sign are we holding up? We've dealt with inside the church, how we're going to build it up, but for those outside the church, what kind of sign are we holding up? Are we holding up a sign that says, God is here, he is active, and you are welcome to come in and join us? Or are we holding up a sign by what we say and how we act? Are we holding a sign up that says, stay out, no entry? Or like one of my favorite signs that I saw recently, due to ammo shortage, we will no longer be able to offer a warning shot. The church can act like that at times. What sign are we holding up? So Paul, he sort of shows us how we can succeed in that, or how we can fail in that, how we can put up a good sign or a bad sign here. He starts with this principle right here in Scripture that he pulls out of Isaiah. Where in Isaiah it says this, in the law, verse 21, in the law it is written, by people of strange tongues and by the lips of foreigners will I speak to this people, and even then they will not listen to me, says the Lord. Now that's coming out of Isaiah, and he's taking it from a context where Isaiah is telling the people, this is what's going to happen. You're going to be in foreign lands, and even they will speak to you about me, and yet you're still going to reject them. Now Paul's using this in a little different way. He sort of paraphrased this, and he's using it to make a point here. The point that he is making is that strange tongues lead to people running from God. Strange tongues lead to people running from God. They'll reject him, and it actually shows up as judgment for them when they encounter that, because they reject him, even hearing it in strange tongues. So now he makes a very practical example. He gives us sort of a case study of how this works out. He does this in verse 22, where he says this, thus, tongues are a sign, not for believers, but for unbelievers. Well, prophecy is a sign, not for unbelievers, but for believers. Now, perhaps you've read that before. You looked at that and say, wait, what? That seems a little backwards. So hang on. Tongues, this thing that people reject and would run from, are a sign for unbelievers? And yet, prophecy, something they can understand, is a sign for believers? It does seem a little interesting there. I've wrestled with that myself a little bit, until I just asked, well, what is he talking about as a sign here? And what kind of sign is he talking about here? Well, the sign that he's talking about is an indication of what is to happen. It's almost like a stop sign. You put a stop sign up to do what? To get someone to stop, right? Well, the Corinthians, what they were doing is putting up a sign for unbelievers. That was essentially saying, you're not welcome here. You're not welcome here, and you can't understand what's going on. The sign was saying we're about ourselves. We're about getting attention for ourselves. And if an unbeliever sees a sign like that, what response are they going to have? They're going to run. They're going to get out of there. That's what's going to happen. And the other way, if you have a sign, the sign for believers, if it's prophecy, here as he's using, well, it's a sign that it leads people to be believers. It points them to the way, because that's a sign saying that God is present, God is active, and you are welcome. And there's a chance then that somebody may enter. We might want to think about what signs we put up then, in the way we act and the gifts we use. Because either way here, the focus, it was going to be one way or the other. It's either an inward focus or it's an outward focus. It's a focus that excludes people and keeps them going and being unbelievers, or it's going to be a focus that is of outreach that actually bring them in. And so he uses his example here. Verse 23, if therefore the whole church comes together and all speak in tongues, and unbelievers or outsiders enter, what's going to happen? If they come into a place that's focused on themselves, getting all the attention, making sure that they know they're the ones that are important, not caring about others, what is going to happen? Will they not say, you're out of your minds? And it's the wrong sign to be put up for unbelievers. But if all prophesy, and an unbeliever or outsider enters, what's going to happen? The sign that shows God is active. And in fact, this prophecy, as it's shown here, is being directed at the people who come in, meaning that's ministry being done to them. What's going to happen? He is convicted by all. He is called to account by all. The secrets of his heart are disclosed, and so, falling on his face, he will worship God and declare that he is really among you. You hear that? That's a good sign. Sign that draws people in, because the focus is not on themselves, but is on others. Paul's showing us here that there are gifts and ways that we use them that are going to push people away. There are gifts and ways that we use them that are going to pull people in. But just think about that. What gifts might push away? It might seem crazy to some, but the way that we do church can push some people away for bad reason. Not just good, not just because they're convicted and don't want to deal with it, but sometimes there's things that we can do that will push people away. You can probably think of a few things yourself. There are attitudes we can have, attitudes of being pushy, rude, holier than thou, or really just focusing all on ourselves, that it's all about us without caring about a community that's around us. An attitude like that, even accidental, even coming up just a little bit, can push people away. You can think about the language too. How we use our language, how we talk to people. I was thinking about myself, because this is something that I need to be aware of. I like to talk. I think you guys probably figured that out already. And sometimes my words, I can use them poorly. And I could really fail if I just wanted to show off and throw out all the academic language or theological language out there. I was thinking something like this. If I said, well, as you can see in this text, the ammunition use of the aorist tense only gives fodder for the competing views of adherents on either side of the transubstantiation argument. Doing something like that, throwing out big words just to show how smart somebody is. Somebody comes into church and hears something like that, what are they going to do? I hope they run. At that point, it's like, that's not good. That's not good. We can fall into that. Maybe it's not big words. Maybe it's just our Christianese. I am sick of how many, I went to Big Lots and I saw so many little mitts, oven mitts, that had on them a saying, too blessed to be stressed. And I am just sick of that. Oh my, I'm sorry for all you who love those, but I am just sick of those. That is Christianese that's entering into the public there. It's like, what does it mean to be blessed? What does it mean to be too blessed to be stressed? Things like that. When we use words, cliches, things like that, sometimes that can push some people away. So we should be careful. Not just how we act, but also what we say. Make sure that our gifts, our words, all of that are intelligible. Because back in Corinth, what was wrong was that they were being unintelligible to people who were coming in. We need to be intelligible in the way that we act, in the way that we talk. And we got to watch out, because sometimes we get into patterns of traditions or expectations for ourselves or others that sort of put up walls for people. And we got to keep an eye out for those. So the sign we have up isn't a sign saying go away, but a sign that says you're welcome here. And so what are those gifts then that pull? So your gifts, they were given for a purpose. And if we use them wrong, well, they're going to do damage, but we can use them right. So when it comes to speech gifts, when it comes to just talking with people, we need to use words that will prepare hearts to receive the gospel. See, the greatest gift that we have, and this is one that we all have, is our testimony of what God has done in our lives. We all have those words that we can give, and we can all make that intelligible for people. And it starts, Paul talks about the prophecy here bringing about conviction in somebody's heart. That's where it does start. That's where our gospel starts. Our gospel starts, our good news starts with some bad news. And our bad news, most people know. We've all sinned and fallen short. Most people catch that pretty easily. We've all sinned and fallen short. But we have the good news that we can share. This great gift, especially this time of the year. At Christmas, we have the opportunity to share that. That good news is that even though we are sinners and we have fallen short, that God loved us so much that he sent his son, Jesus Christ. So yes, come as a baby and then live that life we were meant to live and die the death that we deserved, and then come back to life, be raised from the dead in glory to show us the way to heaven and make that way open if we would believe in him. See, that's our good news, and we know how that's affected our lives. That's a gift we have that we can share with others in an intelligible way, not in tongues, but from the heart of God, like prophecy here. All right, so when it comes to the other gifts as well, we got to be asking the question, is it about us or is it about other people? What's going to bring people in? This, especially now, is a time of year where we can think about that. Just look around at this town, think of your neighbors, think of the people that you interact with. Especially this week, is a week when people are sensitive to what God is doing. Because everybody's talking about Christmas, and even if they don't believe the story, a lot of people know it. This is our chance to share. I would encourage you one way to put up a sign that invites people in is to do just that. Invite somebody this week. This week we're going to have caroling. We're going to have Christmas Eve service. That's an excellent service for somebody to come into who maybe hasn't been to church in a while or maybe never, and have a chance in an environment to hear the story of Jesus Christ. Or maybe Sunday morning as we celebrate the day after Christmas, the Christmas story, and talk about the good news that we have. These are times to invite people in, to show them love, to be there, and like Paul has said, to go ahead and bring the word to build up, to encourage, and to console, to be active in doing that. Now, I will say we are blessed in many ways to be an active church. We got a lot of people who help out in a lot of ways, and you should be encouraged in that. There's a lot of blessings that we get to pronounce, that we get to even boast about because of the love that's poured out here. But we got more people out there to reach out to. This is the time for us to do it. So let's step out. It's easy, so easy to fall into that pattern of turning back to ourselves, puffing ourselves up. But we need to be building up this church, encouraging one another, and building out this church, reaching out to those in need. This is the time to do it, especially this week. So let's go out there and live with our eyes focused on others, and seeking to serve the Lord by reaching out and inviting people in.